Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back for another episode of Gates to Goodness, where every night during this blessed month of Ramadan, we will be discovering new topics to get to the gates of goodness and increase in nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I am your host, Youssef Kromah, and we have some amazing guests here today. I would like to begin by introducing our beloved brother in Islam, Sheikh Suleiman, all the way from Dearborn, Michigan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khairan, brother Yusuf.
I mean, Wayak, it's always a pleasure to have you here today. Alhamdulillah. Next up, I would like to introduce one of our favorite guests and a veteran of this show, brother Idris Surah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Always a pleasure.
Alhamdulillah, I'm liking the shirt today as well, inshallah.
Trying to compete with you.
Oh, mashallah. Next up, we have brother Amir, mashallah, all the way from Fayoum. May Allah bless you for taking the long ride journey to be with us here today. May Allah bless you for your efforts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alhamdulillah. So to get right into our subject today, we have a very, very crucial topic that we'll be speaking about, something that's very serious and a plague that this ummah has a very difficult time with. Sometimes that we're ridiculed as Muslims when people ask us about different texts and things like this regarding violence against women. Again, we're talking about violence against women. So something that's many times slept under the rug in different countries, and some of the ulama shy away from the subject. But today, inshallah ta'ala, we will be talking about the subject in hopes to shed light upon it, in hopes to correct the misconceptions that many people have, and ultimately in hopes to reverse this idea that abuse in Islam against anyone, but particularly women in Islam, it's okay. It's absolutely not. There's no room for it in the Sharia. There's no room for it in our lives, in our households, in our families. So inshallah ta'ala, we will be swinging the topic firstly to Sheikh Suleiman to open up this discussion, beginning with the rights of the woman in a marriage.
I think, Wallahu a'lam, that this is, we can all agree this is a very important discussion, a very long discussion. But more importantly, maybe we should begin by discussing the different rights of a woman in general in Islam before we discuss just the rights of a woman in marriage.
Sure.
Because you and I know, as Muslims, that women have a lot of rights in Islam. Others who are looking into Islam without the correct understanding, or people who are watching, Fox News and things like that, they don't understand what Islam really is about. And so a lot of people ask, are women oppressed in Islam? Or why are women oppressed in Islam? Or why don't women have rights in Islam? And the Muslim sisters are laughing and responding, oh, we have a lot more rights than you think.
Right.
And then once they start explaining what their rights are throughout all their phases in life, as daughters, as sisters, as mothers, as wives, they have so many rights that a lot of non-Muslims, when we're doing open Q&As, they would say things like, wow, I should just become Muslim right now. You have more rights than us. And so maybe we can begin with just the economic aspect, just as a small example. We don't have to go in depth with this. But if you look at the Sharia from an economic aspect, you see that women have rights in regards to not having a single ounce of obligation to spending on their family. As daughters, as sisters, as mothers, as wives, they don't have any obligation. The obligation goes to the father, and then to the sons, to the brothers, and so on and so forth. So they're being spent on their entire lives. And then there's the aspect of the dowry, the mahr. And so the mahr is a gift. This is purely for her. Nobody can take from this mahr, even her parents, her children, other people, the husband. This is for her. She has no obligation to use that in her marriage. And then you have the aspect of inheritance. So a lot of people will say, why do women in some cases inherit only half of what men inherit? And they would say, looking at it, that this is not equality. But in Islam, it's not just about our perception of equality. Rather, there are roles and rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given men and women. So men have some preference in some areas, and women have some preference in some areas. And so from the economic aspect, women have no obligation to spend whatsoever their entire lives on their families, even though they do very generously, as we all see this with our mothers and our sisters and our daughters and wives. But they inherit half of whatever it is the situation is. They inherit half of what the male would inherit, but they keep all of it. Whereas the male who inherits twice as much has to spend everything possible on his family, on his wife, on his daughters, on his children, and so on and so forth. So just from an economic perspective, women have, the Prophet ﷺ came at a time in which women could not own property. They could not, most of the women could not own their own businesses even, except those of the elite. And so the Prophet ﷺ came with the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the reformation for society that women are allowed to inherit, they're allowed to own property, they're allowed to own businesses, they're allowed to make money, they're allowed to work, they're allowed to inherit, they're allowed to do all of this, but they don't have to spend on anybody. And this is for them. And this is a small, concise summary of the economic aspect. If you and I look at the spiritual aspect, men and women are generally equal when it comes to spirituality. We have our roles and our rights. We have responsibilities as men and women to do certain things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He says in the end of Surah Al-Imran, فَاسْتَجَابَ لَهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ أَنِّي لَا أُضِيعُ عَمَلَ عَامِلٍ مِّنْكُمْ مِنْ ذَكِرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى بَعْضُكُمْ مِنْ بَعْضٍ. The Lord responded to them, after they made this dua that we see in Surah Al-Imran, responded to them that I would not overlook, or none of your deeds will be overlooked or missed, male or female. And so spiritually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even mentions nafsin wahida, we're created male and female from one divine breath. We're on an equal spiritual playing field. Nobody can say men are better than women spiritually, or women are better than men spiritually because of this or because of that. So you have the spiritual aspect, you have the economic aspect, and then people want to talk about the issue of marriage, or the issue of the verse 34 of Surah An-Nisa that's always brought up and always discussed. And there's a lot to say about this. But before we say that, generally, what do you guys think from your personal experiences as Muslims who have been in many different parts of the world, whether it's here in Egypt or in the United States? What are your experiences with your own sisters, mothers, wives, in regards to how they're treated or their rights in Islam?
We'll begin with Idris, inshallah.
For me, I think you have to look at it as on several different fronts. If being a Muslim male is that, for one, being the shows gates of goodness, women are a gate for goodness for you to get to Jannah.
Yes.
They could be your route to Jannah, out of this crazy world we live in and the things we have to go through. So it's a motivation to be good as best you can. Also, I think it's a big responsibility whenever whether you're being in charge of someone else. Some people look at it as like a sort of like a chauvinist thing, like that, or a power play or something that that the male has to be in charge. But in reality, it's in every situation where you have more than one person, you need a leader. You can't have a chaotic way of doing things. Every situation, whether it be a business, every relationship, say for instance, if you have 7 brothers who are going on a trip, there should be one person who leads.
So it's not necessarily equality, but equity.
Yes. So it's not necessarily, it makes sense for the person who reflects and thinks. It's not like necessarily a power play. And it isn't something that's like, looked upon as like something you really want it and you're happy to get. It's more of a, oh wow, okay, this is on my shoulders, I hope I handle this okay more. And don't look at it as though like this is my right and you feel like that. For me, that's what I've learned through the years of coming up and learning about this topic.
And Amr as well, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, well, this is a very important and big topic, as Sheikh Sulaiman said, but for me as an experience here in Egypt, I see women like they're taking power every day in social and economic life, maybe more than men. So I see, like, when I was in the States, my supervisor asked me, like, how's the status of women in your back home? And I said, I think maybe soon men will call for equality with women because they're taking more places in work and in education, and they're very smart, and I don't see any problem with this. The only problem is like we confuse the cultural wrongdoings with the religion itself. So and we take it as this is what Islam says. Sure. It's like when someone is like, I don't know, insulting his wife or something, they attach it to Islam. And I say this is not related to Islam, this is maybe related to the culture. Some wrongdoings people do, but don't relate this to Islam, because Islam is the best religion. Islam grants women in all their rights, and maybe more than men. So this is what I said.
That's very true. SubhanAllah, this issue that we're discussing today is an issue that has a lot of cultural connotations that need to be removed so that we can go back to the original text of the Quran and Sunnah without these cultural interpretations that are sometimes prone to human mistakes.
Sure.
And we see this, the proof of this is that every culture has a different interpretation sometimes when they take the religious text and they implement it in a different way. And if you go from Muslim country to country, or you go to places where Muslims are minorities, you'll see all these differences in which Muslims are trying to implement their understanding of it. But we need to always go back to the most correct, pure understanding so that we don't have any mistakes in the way that we're implementing practically the Quran and Sunnah in our lives. Maybe we can discuss the verse of Surah An-Nisa, because the topic today is about violence against women. And of course, there are going to be some people who watch and say, what about violence against men? Listen, today's episode is about violence against women. Okay, if there's violence against men, this is something we obviously have a problem with, but this is not today's topic. And so we're not belittling anything else, but our focus today is about the issue of violence against women in regards to marriage. So the verse that a lot of people take culturally with ignorance and try to implement as a justification for violence or beating or hitting their wives is the verse of Surah An-Nisa. And this is the only verse that's used. This is verse 34. And the verse begins with actually something that Brother Idris mentioned, الرجال قوامون على النساء. So men are قوامون على النساء. Now some people say قوامون, oh, we are the leaders over women. We are in charge of all women. And some people look at it as a dictatorship. Oh, this is a marriage? No, this is I'm in charge. This is my marriage. Marriage is not about one person being in charge. It's not about a power play. Marriage, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Rum, which we hear in almost every wedding or engagement, the same verse over and over and over, we hear this, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. He made first He made for you pairs, from amongst you a pair, and He made between you mawadda, unconditional love, wa-rahmah, mercy. Now this unconditional love means if you have a problem with your spouse or conflict arises, you're going to still have unconditional love, because this is a sacred type of contract with this person that you're entering by the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is a divine sacred contract, an agreement. It's an amana, a trust. So how dare anyone ever think for a moment in their lives that they will take somebody else's daughter and they will take her to wherever they live, whether it's far away or near her family, and that dare ever hit her or lay his hand upon her. This is not something found in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Now this verse, some people say men have leadership over women, preference over women. We mentioned before that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives men some preference in some areas and women preference in other areas. And so when it comes to the issue of the family, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed, the one who created us and knows our differences as men and women, knows our psychological, mental, emotional, physiological, biological differences, He decreed that men are caretakers of women. And there's a difference here. They are not in charge, but rather caretakers. When you and I think of a caretaker, such as the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Qayyum, you don't think of a caretaker in a negative light. Oh, he's going to hit this person or hurt this person. There's no pain. It's a positive connotation. So when you think of men as caretakers of women, they are responsible, they are obligated to take care of their wives, their sisters, their daughters, their mothers in every way possible. They are supposed to protect them physically from all harm, some place of security. They're supposed to help them emotionally, listening to them, helping them with their problems. They're supposed to help them religiously if they need help religiously. And of course, they're supposed to help them financially throughout their entire lives with no exception. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, بِمَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave some of them preference over others. Again, in some areas and not others. وَبِمَا أَنفَقُوا مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ. And from what men are spending of their wealth of obligation. We have no say. We are caretakers, we also have to spend. Now if somebody says, there's a lot of interesting problems that people complain about, especially in countries in which there's a lot of poverty and inflation and economic depression. People are complaining about issues such as the wife wanting to work or not wanting to work, the wife not spending or spending on the family. Here's all I personally have to say about this issue before we proceed with the verse. You and I know that if a woman is treated with love and she's given her rights in a marriage, this issue would not come up. Anybody who's given their rights back and forth, husband and wife, they're both putting into the marriage, they're putting in real effort, then they're both going to get something out of it. Meaning the wife will, on her own, be generous. And this is how women are, generally speaking. They're very generous. It's actually, when we look at the men in society, Muslims or otherwise, we usually see the problem of finances with men not wanting to spend as much. And so we always hear issues of husband is stingy, husband doesn't want to spend. But the women are never complained about in this regards. Women are usually, generally, very generous. And our own mothers, we can see this in our lives, they're very generous. Daughters, sisters, they're very generous. And so they have no obligation, and yet they still give. Men have an obligation, and sometimes they have issues with this. Let's fast forward, because we don't want to focus only on tafsir for this verse. I know I'm taking some time here. But fast forward to the part in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is discussing this righteous woman. فَالصَّالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٌ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. So the righteous woman, the one who obeys Allah and is protective of that which is unseen. So some scholars say this is her protecting the unseen, meaning her chastity in her husband's absence. She's not going to cheat on her husband. There's loyalty, there's trust, there's love in this marriage. It's real, it's genuine. She's also not going to violate the unseen, her belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, faith. And then it says, and then if you fear from them nushuzan. It's translated sometimes as uprising. This is where people are taking this verse out of context. If you fear this type of uprising from the wife, and it begins with the response for men, if you fear this will happen, then what do? You have to advise them, admonish them, warn them. فَعِظُوهُنْ مَوْعِظًا. And so when you advise them or admonish them, this is not an example of somebody saying, but my wife, she raised her voice. But my wife, she cooked the meal, it was undercooked. I came back from a long day of work and my meal wasn't even, she didn't even make any meal. Well, what kind of wife is this? And he starts complaining. And he says, this is a justification for this verse. No, it's not. This verse is referring to extreme cases that are related to the parts that we just mentioned before. She's violating, for example, the chastity between her and her husband. He's fearing that there might be cheating or adultery or infidelity taking place. This is something serious, not something small that a lot of cultures just complain about, and this becomes a problem in many marriages. So the first step, if you fear, but nothing is clear yet, there's nothing evident that your wife has done wrong with regards to an example of cheating, for example. So the woman, for example, she's leaving the house every night, and the man notices his wife is leaving. Now she's putting on a lot of makeup, she's going out late, she's coming back in the morning. Something weird is going on. And he's worried and he fears. So the first step is to talk, communicate. And a lot of times people have problems in marriages, and a lot of cultural people, they don't communicate much, so what they end up doing is resorting to violence. They resort to physical aggression. And the first thing Allah tells us is to admonish, talk. Talk it out. Communication is key in marriages. And then what? If you still fear that something is wrong and it's escalating now the problem you're concerned about is getting much worse. The issue, the example, let's say, of infidelity, cheating. So what happens after that? وَهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ. So forsake them in the beds, and the literal translation is hit them or strike them. This is where people take this and say, look, my wife did something wrong, I can hit her. No, not at all. This is a complete misunderstanding of the verse. And no scholar of tafsir has ever said this is exactly what it means. You're just angry and upset in a normal everyday conflict that you resort to aggression or violence. This is not mentioned anywhere. So what happens here? People see this and they don't understand. You forsake them in the beds, you hit, in which case? Let's give the example again of infidelity. Muslim or non-Muslim, a man walks into his house and sees somebody else with his wife. We see this in the news all the time. How do they react? Sometimes it goes as far as killing, right? Like it's a crazy situation. Nobody would walk in on their wife or their spouse and see somebody else there and be like, oh, that's fine. Otherwise, there's a problem. Anybody would become angry and upset. And so their reaction is justified to an extent. It is justified to an extent. What's the extent? وَضْرِبُهُنْ. Now this word, وَضْرِبُهُنْ, hit or strike. Some people say it doesn't have any boundaries, but there are boundaries. You don't just take things and say, this is what it means. That's out of context. And as Muslims, we of all people should know how bad it feels to have others take things out of context from us. So we cannot be taking verses out of context. It says, وَضْرِبُهُنْ, hit, right? But the scholars say, the scholars of tafsir and fiqh and others, they look at it and say, this does not mean you're allowed to ever bruise anybody. It is never permissible to bruise somebody when you touch them, when you hit them. Whether it's your wife, your husband, your children, you're not allowed to leave a mark. You know that red mark that you leave when you just slap somebody hard? Just like, even when you high-five somebody, you can leave a mark. It's not allowed to go that far. The hitting has to be something gentle. It's not even hitting that's supposed to have some kind of physical response or reaction. It's supposed to have a psychological one. Because if you're angry with your spouse, or you're angry with somebody, and you just lightly tap them or shove them, it's going to mean a lot psychologically. It'll have an effect. Whereas hitting is not allowed where there's any kind of bruise or mark or anything like this whatsoever. This is something we have to clarify, just to make it explicitly clear. This is not permissible in Islam. Hitting where it leaves a mark is not permissible in Islam. And anybody who's watching today, we urge people to remember, this is not permissible in Islam at all.
Okay, so let's backtrack a little bit, Sheikh. We're talking about violence in Islam. So let's qualify the term violence itself. There's physical violence, which we're talking about right now, but there's also psychological violence.
Yes.
There's emotional violence. Violence can be neglect. Violence can be many different things.
Right.
So let's talk about the different facets of violence in a relationship, and not just a brother. Someone may be watching and say, well, I never physically put my hands on my wife, so I didn't abuse her, and I was never violent against her. But sometimes even in literature, you'll say the editor did such a violence against the text, we couldn't understand what the author was actually trying to say. So when people commit these acts, they do such a violence against Islam that people misconstrue Islam over in its entirety and say, this is what the religion is saying. You've done a violence against the religion.
Absolutely.
Not only your spouse, but against the religion and your children. Because many times the children internalize the things that are happening in the house. So what are some of the different factors of violence? What are some different ways that violence come about? And, how do we remedy these things within relationships?
I think, and subhanAllah, we were just getting there with the end of the verse, because so we have a clear understanding now of what hitting is or isn't. There's clear limitations. And anybody who did not know before that's watching today or later on, they now have the responsibility of implementing what they have learned. However, there's also the psychological aspect, because there is a lot of psychological abuse, emotional abuse that people are going through in marriages, whether it's men or women, because it happens both ways. But today we're focusing on the issue of violence against women. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ends the verse with, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيًّا كَبِيرًا. Verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most exalted, the most grand. For a man to think, I'm in charge, and they abuse their wives emotionally or physically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding them in this verse of admonishment, the same verse they're quoting and trying to justify, where they take one word out of the entire ayah. Allah is reminding them that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately is the exalted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Kabir, the great. You yourself are just a human being, and you yourself have an amana, a responsibility. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَعَاشِرُوهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Treat your wives, treat your spouses with goodness, with righteousness. And the greatest proof of this, of what you just said about psychological and emotional, is 2 verses later. 2 verses later, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in a longer verse, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ. All these categories of people, worship Allah, do not associate partners. And then what? To your parents, be righteous, be good, be gentle, be humble. And to whom? To your relatives, to the orphans, to the needy, to your neighbors that are close, the neighbors that are far, to the people that you are befriended with next to you, and the people that you commute next to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning all of these people 2 verses later to be so gentle and righteous. So how can a man read the verse before and say, well, except the wife, except the wife? This does not make any sense whatsoever. It's taken simply out of context.
Now, on a social level, if we do agree, we say men are الرجال قوامون على النساء, the men are the caretakers of women. I often contemplate sometimes when I hear this horrible stories of sisters getting abused. I think, where are the men? Where are the fathers? Where are the brothers? Where's the Wali of Amr? Because I know as a man with 6 sisters, if there's somebody physically abusing any woman in my family, he's going to have to speak with me, or my brothers, or my father. He's going to have to speak to somebody. There's going to be accountability. So I'm thinking, as Muslim men, where is this qawamuna?
Do you know what the problem is? I think a lot of times when there's physical abuse or emotional abuse, they're afraid to speak up. And our sisters should not be afraid to speak up. They're afraid because they fear that there might be bigger problems.
Exactly.
This is the reality. And here's the issue. If there's somebody that's dealing with physical violence, and for any males who are listening to it, if there's somebody that has a problem with physical aggression, they have to get some kind of treatment.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing embarrassing. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. Some people deal with things in the wrong way, and so there needs to be some kind of actual professional help. There's nothing embarrassing about this. But hitting is not allowed. Now, a lot of women, when they go through abuse, they don't want to complain. They just don't. They will stay silent, and what happens is now they're going through more emotional abuse, fearing, and they become like the subjugated, the weak, the inferior in the marriage and the relationship. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. It's supposed to be unconditional love and mercy. It's supposed to be consultation. You don't just boss each other around. This is not a power play. If you're having problems where the husband and wife are having a power struggle, then they both need some kind of counseling. Because marriage is not about that. Marriage requires both of them to put in their effort to work together. But if one starts to subjugate the other, then there's a problem here. So the wives who end up going through this and they don't complain need to start talking. Either they go and seek professional help, or they have to start getting their families involved.
And we as men should create a culture in which they feel comfortable in. Many sisters will go to the masajid and imam and say, side with the side of the husband, so they feel like, who am I going to speak to, because I've already spoken about it and nobody's going to listen to me.
Wallahi, that's unfortunate, and that's very sad to hear. And that things like that do happen, and much worse. And wallahi, all the messages that we receive on a daily basis of different domestic abuse or violence, things like this, there are a lot of problems that people need help with.
Sure.
Ultimately, I believe if a person is going through this, that they should bring somebody into it. They should tell somebody. They should not remain a secret, because how long are you going to put up with it? How long are you going to stay subjugated and abused emotionally and psychologically?
Absolutely.
And as you said, the men of the ummah are not allowed to see this and stay silent.
No.
That's ridiculous. Would you allow for your own sister or mother or anybody else to go through this? Absolutely not. And so we definitely have to create a culture of understanding, speaking, helping out as much as possible. And sometimes, of course, we don't want, because some men will go to the other extreme. When they hear about this, they'll go and kill somebody. They'll go and react in a way that's not Islamic as well. And so we also need to be understanding, but we have to respond with wisdom. We have to respond in a way that is most effective and efficient for that marriage to either thrive or for things to move on.
Yeah.
And this is the reality of the situation, wallahu alam.
Before we even get there, though, let's talk about some of the causes that may lead someone to get to a state of aggression. I would like to get you guys involved. I have this understanding sometimes as men, like in terms of giving tarbiyah, we don't have problem-resolving abilities. So if something occurs between men and we don't find a way to resolve it, immediately we result to what? Physical action.
Yeah.
But we don't, many times we aren't giving the acculturation to say, let's talk things through. Let's come up with different means of solving problems. So what are some different causes or sources of that may lead a man to physically abuse a woman?
Well, I think first of all you said something about children internalizing like what the elders do. So one of the main causes is like when a kid sees his father beating his mother.
Mm-hmm.
So he internalized this as he has the right to do this. So when he grow up, he does this to his wife. So as a right, his right to do this. And the worst thing is like when he sees his father talking or explaining or justifying this, saying that I have the right to do this because she's my wife, she did something wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and he attached this to Quran as like Sheikh Sulaiman said, this is not right. This is completely not related to Quran, and people misinterpret the ayah. So this is a clear declaration that this has nothing to do with Islam. So, and this is one of the causes, to internalize what the elder is doing, and you start doing it as your right. And I think one thing also is like when women are afraid to speak out, and then they become afraid, so they give their men the right to do this because there is no consequences.
Exactly.
He's doing it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and no one is putting him into
They
account.
have to speak up.
Yes, exactly.
If the husband is not willing to go to counseling with the wife, if the husband is not willing to change at all, she has to tell somebody.
Of course.
This is an absolute must,
Yeah.
because especially in the beginning of marriages, if this starts from the very beginning, it's going to continue. And we have seen this with all types of people's problems. Wallahu alam.
Absolutely.
And it's extremely important to know that, again, to emphasize that a lot of people have their own problems, their own baggage, whether it's through trauma from a younger age, seeing their parents, because a lot of people do have that problem and many others don't. Many others have been aggressors or have been physically violent, and they never had problems when they were younger. And so we have to realize that when somebody has a problem, even us, when we have problems in life, let's not try to drag religion into it and justify using religion.
Sure.
Because we've seen all types of examples with Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others who try to do things and then try to justify it with religion. Slavery was justified with the Bible at one point.
Right.
And so we see people trying to justify things with religion. We have to first be truly honest with ourselves, and then we have to try to remove the issue of religion out of the picture and look at what is causing us to do this.
Right.
Sometimes it's cultural. People grow up not seeing just their family members, but seeing TV shows and movies where people are doing this.
Absolutely.
And it's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
No.
And in other places, people are seeing it in the streets. Somebody once called me and said, somebody's hitting his wife in the street. They're physically beating their wife to a pulp. She's bleeding, and people are walking by and not doing anything about it. This is in the Middle East, of course. Not doing anything about it. And so, Allahu Alam, but if we as men are not doing anything to help the situation become better, then we're part of the problem, without doubt.
That's true.
And we need to address the situation as much as possible, as wisely as possible, and address all angles of it, like you said. And so I think Brother Idris was probably going to mention some things that lead people to this. Wallahu Alam.
For me, I was just going to mention about, as the question he asked about a cause for it, but I think another major cause is nothing to do with also the woman, but with the man not knowing how to be a leader.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times people enter a marriage, they have no idea what it means to lead someone. They have this preconceived notions that now life is going to be good. As if being a leader, you know, like they see the kings, the presidents, and, you know, they have this royal and lush life, and it's bigger than, you know, this is their idea of becoming a leader. They don't know what it means to be a leader.
They're not mature enough.
So they can't enter it correctly, and it turns out to be a disaster because of this. Being a leader is a huge responsibility, and having wonderful leadership qualities, especially in a marriage, so that people want to follow you. Your wife will want to follow you if you're a good leader. If you're not, and your wife is being rebellious, then you need to look at yourself. Obviously, you're doing something wrong. Because a good leader can turn people around and lead them and help them, not just poke at them and blame them and look at them as the cause.
Now we're going to have some people who are listening who are going to say, well, listen, I'm trying to be patient, I'm trying to be a good leader, but my wife is not good. I think this is something that needs to be addressed as well. What do you think, Brother Youssef?
Yes, directly after the break, we'll have a short break, and we'll get back into this very crucial conversation about violence against women. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy upon us. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Every year during Ramadan, a lot of fiqh questions being raised, such as, what happens if I swallow some water by accident while performing wudu, while fasting? Would that invalidate my fasting? Is it permissible to brush my teeth while fasting? And the sisters who ask, is it permissible to taste the food while cooking? While fasting, would that invalidate my fasting? And of course, not to forget the typical debate every Ramadan with regards to Taraweeh. 8 rak'ahs or 20 rak'ahs. Shall we make the qunut before ruku' or after ruku'? The witr prayer, is it 1 rak'ah or 3 altogether? These questions and many others will be answered insha'Allah during our program Ask Huda, which will be aired during Ramadan every week from Sunday through Thursday, exactly at 5 p.m. Mecca time sharp. You can simply call in to drop your live question, or you can send your question in advance to my page, Dr. Muhammad Salah Official. May Allah the Almighty accept our fasting. May Allah forgive us our sins, and may Allah guide us to what is best.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.
We all know that a person's iman increases and decreases, and the best way to increase your iman is through the Quran.
To contemplate, to reflect, to ponder over the verses of the Quran.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.
In this program, we will listen to the Quran first, and that should soften our hearts. And then once we get to know the meanings and contemplate over these meanings, then we can change by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
ولا يأتونك بمثل إلا جئناك بالحق وأحسن تفسيرا. ولا يأتونك بمثل إلا جئناك بالحق وأحسن تفسيرا.
Join us this Ramadan for Quran Circle 2.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back for another episode of Gates of Goodness. I'm your host, Youssef Kromah, and today we're talking about violence against women. So we picked off last, we were discussing the sources of violence, why sometimes in relationships men resort to violence, and Sheikh Suleiman was just about to make a crucial point before we cut to break. So we're going to go back to Sheikh Suleiman and let him finish his point, inshallah ta'ala.
Barakallahu feek. I was just bringing up the question that we should ask, which is, what about people who are watching this, who do agree with everything that's said, so this is the correct understanding, but somebody will say, I am a good leader, I'm a good husband, I'm very patient, I spend on my wife, I give her emotional needs and everything else, and the wife is rebellious in this case. What is the extent of what he's allowed to do, or what should he do? What should a person like this be advised to do in problems or conflict that arise in this situation? What do you guys think?
For me, I would say just look at the Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Look at how he, I mean, there's a...
Did he ever hit his wife, the Prophet?
He never.
Any of them?
I mean, look at his conflict resolution, as we say in today's terms. How did he resolve his conflicts? Do you think he didn't have conflicts with his wives? He had conflicts just like anyone else. I mean, look at the Sahaba. How did they solve their conflicts? I mean, what about the, we mentioned how, I think it was the show, I can't remember, but we mentioned how Umar ibn Khattab was talking to his wife, and one of the Sahaba came to him to ask him a question. But he overheard he was about his wife, he wanted to complain about his wife. He overheard Omar's wife yelling at him. Then he left and said, if his wife is yelling at him, then I don't have anything to say. You know, basically, I'm summarizing. He was going back. And Omar came out, told him, where are you going? You wanted me. Why are you leaving? He said, I heard your wife, and I came to you to complain about my wife. So I figured, what's the point? You have the same problem. And he told him, well, why would I treat her not good when she had my children, when she helps me in the house and she does so well for me? Be patient with her. Where's the muwadda, as we say?
The Prophet ﷺ said very clearly, the best of you are best to their wives. Those who are best to their wives. And the Prophet ﷺ, in the sermon speech, the farewell speech that we talked about in yesterday's episode, again, everything in that short speech is extremely concise and powerful. And every single part of it, every phrase of it, is an entire lecture. And part of it was addressed to the men: take care of your wives, take care of your wives, be gentle with your wives. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us of this, وَعَشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us of this, مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is our prime role model. So if you want to understand these verses of the Qur'an, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was a walking example of the Qur'an, as Aisha radiallahu anha said. So when you look at that, you say, how did the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam deal with his wives? And you see that in the worst case scenario, in one situation, the Prophet ﷺ tapped Aisha because of something that she had done, radiallahu anha. But he tapped her, and again, it was a psychological response. It was not a physical one, because she had done something that was not healthy for the marriage. And so you look at an example of Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah. He said, I have not argued with my wife for 40 years. He said, may Allah have mercy on her. So some people would read this out of context, because one of the youth sent me this and said, what? That's ridiculous. There's no marriage where you can't argue for 40 years. Like, this is not a real marriage. Something is wrong here. But of course, you continue reading it and you see that they asked him, Imam Ahmad, how's that possible? He said, because when my wife was upset, I would not respond. I would not also become upset. And when I was upset, she would not also become upset. When somebody else is angry in the marriage or any relationship, don't also become angry. And it's easier said than done, without doubt. But once we implement it, we start seeing the fruits of it. Just wait, be patient, be calm, let the person vent. Talk about it later if you have to, or talk about it in a gentle, wise way. But in any conflict, there has to be conflict resolution. And for an example of the person that we said after the break, somebody who says, you know what, I am patient. In this case, my wife is the one who is rebellious. Then we would say, be patient. We would say, you have to still do the things that you're commanded to do. Learn conflict resolution, and take your wife with you when you learn. Learn communication skills, learn some things about marriage. Now in some masajid in the West, they're actually requiring youth to go through some kind of marriage class, premarital counseling before they get married, just to make sure that they're all on the same page, because sometimes some information is just, they simply never come across it their entire lives.
This is a very good point. I remember like maybe 2 months ago, we were in an Arabic class, and we were covering lessons like that to deen, like, you know, a woman that, you know, preserves the religion. And this teacher, he asked us, we had to communicate in Arabic, of course. He said that, what if your wife is opposite to this, opposite of woman, this? What would you do? And wallahi, almost like, I would say 98% of the class, their first result or second result was violence. And they were like making motions like, you know, uppercuts, I'm going to kick her. Wow. And I was thinking to myself, these are all unmarried young men. So before they even get into relationships, their idea is, I'm going to abuse this woman, before they even have wives. So there's something inherently wrong about the way that young men are being acculturated from very young ages to think that if this is unanimous in a room of all young Muslim men, why is this the culture? That is okay. And nobody said, you know, oh, wait a minute, that's ajib, that's strange. It was like, yeah.
This is the alpha male culture in the West, the alpha male culture. Exactly. The male is in charge, runs everything basically. It has to be basically a dictator in everything they do.
With no consequences.
No consequences. And this is absolutely ridiculous, subhanAllah. And it's sad to hear that. Because you know what? You see a lot of people who, I'm sorry to say, it usually goes back to the parents. when the parents are teaching their children from a young age to be gentle, to be compassionate, that good manners, whether with a marriage or anything else in life, is one of the most important things in the world. The Prophet ﷺ, as was reported by Bukhari, he was asked about the two things that cause most people to enter Jannah. He said, taqwa, God consciousness, fear and love of Allah, wa husnul khuluq, and good conduct, good manners. This is not just outside of your marriage, rather it starts with your own family. It starts with your parents, starts with your spouse and your children. And subhanAllah, again, we ask people, whether it's these young guys that you saw or anybody else that's in a relationship right now in which they are being abusive, we ask them, do you really not fear standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And He asks you, don't you remember when you took this amana, this ahad? This is a mighty severe contract.
Allah.
That you're marrying in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a severe thing. You're taking this person under your care, and you're loving one another unconditionally, regardless of conflict. Now, a lot of people, again, like these youngsters, they'll have problems resolving issues because of something they might have experienced, or because of the culture, because of video games perhaps, or some movies and TV shows, or their own family members, their own parents, wallahu alam. But there are a lot of different types of root problems, and they have to be resolved. If somebody has this problem, they have to resolve this problem. You know, it's interesting. One of the youth once asked, we were teaching them fiqh, jurisprudence, and we were teaching them how there are 5 rulings. So they said, well, not in marriage. I'm like, what do you mean not in marriage? He's like, well, it's never haram to get married for a single person. It's always like you have to get married. I said, no, there's some cases the scholars say it's haram. If somebody knows that he's abusive and he will abuse his wife, then he's not allowed to get married until he resolves this issue. And so in that case, it would be haram for him to get married, especially hiding this psychological issue. So again, we have to go back to the root problems and the solutions, the practical solutions, as well as addressing this issue. What are the best ways to address this with our trends of social media and things like this? The best way is to educate the youth, aside from just taking them to seminars or masajid for them to learn officially. We have to kind of create this culture ourselves and spread it further. Wallahu alam.
And I know there are like certain women's groups and initiatives taken by women, most of the time sister circles, that if you're being abused, you can go and reach out to some people and speak to people. But I feel as though there should be more men leading these initiatives, to help our sisters, to make sure that we're protecting them. And for those of us who are falling short, the men who just don't know, who are acculturated in the wrong way, that there should be brothers groups as well. These are issues that I'm having within my home. How can I resolve this issue? Violence is an issue for me. I was raised in a certain culture where this is the norm, the social norm. How do I change this? How do I transform? Sitting maybe a scholar, just something informal, and we can talk about ways we as men need to deal with conflict resolution, how to to repress maybe an urge of violence or something like this. These are some things that should happen within our communities. So if someone does get abused, it's not swept under the rug. And when it does come to the light, it's not something that we don't have a remedy for. It's not something that we have a systematic way of removing from our culture. Inshallah ta'ala.
The Prophet ﷺ said, "La taghdab," to the man who came and asked him for advice. He said, "Give me more advice." He said, "La taghdab." فَرَدَّدَ مِرَارًا. He kept repeating, "La taghdab," don't become angry. Meaning, don't become angry, not don't have anger. Restrain your anger. Everyone has their issues. So if somebody feels like they do have issues with anger, they should have those issues resolved. There are so many resources in our times for anger management, for domestic abuse, for different things that people are going through. You're absolutely right that men should be spearheading a lot of the issues with regards to violence towards women specifically, but generally towards any kind of good cause, everyone should be working hard.
Absolutely.
I personally would love to see some of the youth or any of our viewers come up with a creative type of video series, very short videos, very wisely made, very modern and high quality, addressing this issue in a very smart way, in a very advanced way, to kind of create this culture of gentleness, create this culture of compassion towards one another, of course a lack of basically a conflict resolution in a very wise way. I think some people, inshallah ta'ala, watching this or others, would be able to come up with something like this. As we know, social media sends these things out virally. One person makes a really, really good video, it goes out virally. And the reward that comes with it is unimaginable. And so we definitely want to see more people working on that, inshallah.
Yeah, now I want to just switch gears a little bit and talk about a different form of violence, which is that of the speech, emotional violence. Certain times, someone may say, I don't physically abuse my wife. I've never physically abused, I never touched her, but in that way, but the things that you say.
Again, though, everything we said applies to both.
Absolutely.
The reality is everything applies to both, and the people who are watching this or others, they have to realize that the tongue is actually one of the most organs that takes people to the hellfire. So we mentioned how good manners take people to paradise, and good manners is not just not physically hitting your brother or your spouse or somebody. Good manners is very general and broad, and it covers everything in the spectrum, and includes especially the tongue. Hold your tongue, hold your tongue. The Prophet ﷺ advised us about the tongue in over 100 different hadith. And the Muslim is the one who protects others basically from the abuse of the tongue. The example of the woman who prayed and fasted and went to Hajj, the Sahaba said, Ya Rasulullah, she does all of these good deeds, but she abuses the neighbors, her neighbor. She orally, verbally abuses them. The Prophet ﷺ said, Hiya finnar. She's going to go to the hellfire for a limited time for that punishment to purify her of this, because this is a severe thing. Imagine if this is with a neighbor, how it would be with your spouse.
Exactly.
The punishment for being abusive with your spouse. Using your tongue to put them down, subjugate them in ways that are not permissible. And the best thing we can say is, whoever believes in Allah on the last day should say something good or remain silent.
Exactly. So now if you don't have anything good to say, you should, you should be quiet. Also, the Prophet ﷺ, we talked about if you find some things in your wife that you don't like, you should look for something that you do like. So now, as opposed to just holding the tongue, maybe you should think about the things that you do like. And alhamdulillah, one of the things I really like about Brother Idris, I never told you this, but whenever we're talking about something of good, wallahi, you always mention your wife. Always. In a positive light. You know, I don't like to overpraise people, but this is a characteristic I always notice about you. Whether it's something, if I remember I was being sick, and he said, oh, my wife, she's, deals in pharmacy, she has the medicine. I was hungry, my wife makes the best pancakes. You know, if it's something about ilm, oh, my wife taught me this. About Arabic, my wife teaches me, I'm like, subhanallah, like he always says something good. You know, and that's something, a very beneficial thing. The more you talk about the goodness, it's hard for you to think about it in a negative light, or, to say something abusive, because it's your habit. And if this is outside of the home, away from her, I can only imagine the way he speaks to her in the household.
Subhanallah.
So subhanallah, certain brothers,
it's very inspirational.
Yeah, they get around the brothers and they say, man, my wife did this. It's almost like the culture. Man, my wife, she didn't do this. So it's kind of the norm. So when you find someone that's like, my wife, she's so good. She's so good to me. She's this way. SubhanAllah. It makes you really rethink things.
Not just that. I believe truly 100% that if a person does that, they're always speaking highly of their wife, whether to her or to others about her. And of course, they shouldn't be exposing any personal things. But if they're always speaking good of their spouse, that's a type of gratitude that Allah will reward. And He will make the marriage even better. And so a lot of times people will complain about their marriage, and then you ask, what are you doing about it? They'll say, nothing. It's horrible. Do something about it. Make dua and do your part to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change the hearts. If there's a problem in any marriage, it's possible to resolve it. If not, in the worst case scenario, people have to move their own ways. That's fine. But people have to realize that there are limitations and there are conditions and there are things that they have to learn to mature towards in order to have a thriving marriage. And some scholars will say like the marriage is like a bank. Whatever you give into it, you'll be able to take out of it. But if both of you are pulling out and you're both like having this struggle and you're always talking bad to your wife or to your husband, you're always subjugating them, you're always abusing them, then you're just pulling out and there's nothing left. There's nothing left in this bank. And so what you end up doing is having a very empty marriage, very shallow, and usually ends up breaking apart if they don't resolve it sooner than later. So definitely with the issue of the tongue, aside from just backbiting and not talking bad about your spouse, when you speak to your spouse, the best thing you can do is if there are problems, learn conflict resolution. Just remain silent, restrain your anger. A lot of people react differently. I think the best thing is for them to communicate to each other, not at a time of conflict, of course, but they should communicate to each other, what would you like me to do when you're angry?
Exactly.
And that's like understanding their language, as they say, the languages of love. So everyone has their own way of reacting to things. And of course, we're trying not to focus too much in this episode only about marriage. This is not a marriage topic, although some people would want it to be. No, this is about violence and some of the root causes of it. So it definitely goes back to some of the skills and traits that a good husband and a good wife would have. And if people don't have them, they should go out and find these things, resources, books, videos, articles, to learn these things. And wallahi, there's so many things we can do in our times to improve our marriage. There's so many easy ways to do it, aside from just making dua and being better ourselves. Wallahu alam.
No, that's a good. And now, just in a general context, generally in society, even in the marketplaces, when women are present, just the way you speak to a woman, the way you call to her, the way in communicating with her, it should be a cultural understanding that it's violence to talk to her in a loud, demeaning manner That's an act of violence against a woman. So in general, you know, we should, inshallah, are there any different advices and things like this we could talk about, just in general context of dealing with women in the public places?
Brother Idris?
For me, on that, I don't really have much to say about that, dealing with in public places. I don't really deal with a lot of them in public places, except for, I think when you, in life in general, when you trying to correct yourself and become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything else falls into place. The more you work on yourself and you're honest with yourself, you'll find things coming in place. You'll find things being fixed. So if you're finding a lot of problems sometimes, it's coming from you a lot of times.
Yes.
Allah is the one who rectifies your deeds sometimes. So, well, sometimes things will happen and you're wondering, how did that work out? I didn't even do anything to make it work out. Why? Because you were doing something else. You were trying to be honest with yourself. You're making istighfar, you know, making dhikr, trying to better yourself, to become closer to Allah, and things will work out for you. I just wanted to get that as a way of people who feel like that things are hopeless and they don't understand how to make it better. Begin with this.
You know what? SubhanAllah, that's amazing, because you reminded me of the verse in Surah Al-Kahf in which the example of the three people and Musa and Khidr, the example of the father, وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا, the father was righteous. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him blessings in his family. And a lot of times the scholars say, if you want to see righteousness in your spouse, in your children, in your home, you want an atmosphere of happiness and tranquility and righteousness, then you yourself be righteous.
And not to cut you off, and it comes from your behavior,
right,
and your adab, and your not just knowledge.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you'll see like a person who's an alim, and you think, wow, but his family life is terrible, and you're wondering, I don't understand.
Manners are more important.
Because it's about how you act, and how you emulate the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions. When you start doing this and start putting it into practice, it's when you'll start seeing the results. Not how much you know, not how much you've heard, not what people say. It's what you do. Find yourself, and at the end of a day, at the end of a week, at the end of a month, sit down, reflect. Have I done anything basically that I regretted? How could I have done that differently? Why did I feel this way? What was going on inside of me? Be honest with yourself and start making this change. You will find things around you changing.
Yeah,
this is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
We have 3 minutes left, inshallah ta'ala. Just speaking about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I'm thinking about one of the first things he dealt with upon receiving his nubuwwah, which was in trying to transform the general society, was talking about the burying of daughters alive. That was one of the first things the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam addressed, violence against women. So before we talked about racism, how sometimes it can be subconscious. So in general society, if you're looking at a woman as less than, as subhuman, as something that doesn't even deserve to have life, that's an issue. That's an issue that needs to be dealt with immediately. The way you think, the way you view women, your perspective about women will inform how you treat them. So inshallah ta'ala, just our own, within our own selves, as Brother Idris was saying, our own psychology about how we look at women in regards to our own selves, and this is human beings in general level, not even our wives, not just a woman in general, how the status that we give women in Islam. Let's learn about some of the great women, how the Prophet ﷺ talked about heaven lies beneath the feet of the mother, the sacrifices that a woman makes, and the blessings of just a woman in general. Let's learn these things and sort of embody them before we even engage at all, inshallah ta'ala. We have a few minutes left, so we can just culminate.
Well, I do want to add something. SubhanAllah, Brother Idris mentioned this earlier, and you just touched upon it again, and Brother Amr mentioned it as well briefly, is that when you're righteous towards women in general, it's actually a path to paradise in so many different ways. And so, as a mother, for example, we know that according to the hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud, the person who wanted to go out for the war, and the Prophet ﷺ told him, are your parents alive? Is your mother alive? He said, yes, then go back to your mother, meaning your struggle is with her, go take care of your mother, for paradise is beneath her feet. Your mother, obeying her and respecting her and showing her love and humility in her entire life is a path to paradise. The spouse as well, taking care of your spouse. This is an amana, a sacred right from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You do it right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for it. The daughters, there's a hadith that mentions whoever raises daughters righteously and protects them or takes care of them, there are many different narrations, it's a path to paradise for them. It's a shield against the hellfire or punishment, and so on and so forth. And so women in general have a very high status in Islam where they are actually a path for us to paradise.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, we also want to mention very clearly and explicitly, in case some viewers might wonder, with regards to feminism and its role in regards to violence against women. what we need to really clarify is that Islam, when it's practiced correctly and we implement it without the culture, gives us all the keys, all the right things that give women all these rights without needing external movements and trends and organizations that come and go and change throughout society. Because a lot of the things that they call towards are actually detrimental to women in the long run or in the short run, wallahu alam, but sometimes people don't see it. And they just want to join like the bandwagon, the trend. This is what people are talking about. And so we have to be careful when it comes to all these other movements, and be careful not to corrupt the Islamic principles, because Islam is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But again, the culture is what we have to remove so that we can get back to the essence and practice it correctly and give everyone their rights in society. Wallahu alam.
Subhanallah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Dear viewers, it has come that time again for us to culminate our show about this crucial topic of violence against women. We know that we can talk about this discussion for years and not do it due justice. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow our message to spread far and wide, and allow inshallah ta'ala to utilize this month to implement goodness, and which is that one of the greatest goodness that you can be is good to your mother, good to your wives, good to your sisters, good to your daughters. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to understand this and allow us to increase ourselves in goodness. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We look forward to having you again for another episode of Gates of Goodness. I'm your host, Youssef Kromah.